Thank you everyone for joining for this important session. As you are aware, uh, in light of the Minister of Electronics and Information Technology releasing their draft Digital Personal Data Protection Rules 2025, IMEI is hosting this virtual knowledge session on the draft DPDP rules with Srinidhi Srinivasan, who is partner and lead data practice at Ikigai Law. For everyone's information, this session is being recorded, and should you have any issue with this, you may please, you know, you know, you may please, inform us if you are not comfortable with the recording of the particular session. To you, Srinidhi.
Great. Hi, thanks so much, Nilotpal, and hi everyone. Very good afternoon. Thank you for making the time to meet us today. Like Nilotpal said, the new set of rules, the draft data protection rules, were just published by MeitY earlier this month. Over the next hour or so, we'll go over some of the key themes in the rules and their impact on the gaming industry. Just allow me a moment to share my screen. Yeah, I hope it's clear. You can see it? Yeah, great. So yeah, I think over the next hour, we'll go over some of the key themes and business impact of the provisions. While there's one specific reference to gaming companies, online gaming intermediaries, but the rest of the provisions are generic in nature. So we'll kind of go over each of them. But just to start off with what the current status is, timelines are, and really how the rules impact businesses. Now, the DPDP Act had been enacted, as you'd all be familiar, in August 23. And after a year's worth of wait, the rules were published earlier this month. These are draft rules. They're open for public consultation. We have until mid next month to submit comments to MeitY on the draft rules. Once these are finalized and notified, which is likely to happen over the course of the next few months, there may be staggered implementation of the rules. The rules related to the Data Protection Board, its establishment, its coming into force will likely take immediate effect, and other requirements, there'll be some kind of a compliance window. Officials have remarked that this could be 2 years, it could be shorter as well, but just as a frame of reference, I think that's what lies ahead. Now, the Act and rules really impact all kinds of businesses because the scope is fairly wide. It's digital personal data. So any kind of information about any individual, identifiable individual is whoever is processing such data is affected by this. The rules also really require three category of changes or for you to revisit your practices. The first is the front end, which is whatever is user facing for a platform, assessing how you take consent, how you're giving notice, reviewing the UI UX on the platform from the time of sign up to how you're showing a privacy notice to an individual, updating your privacy notices, updating your user terms, implementing and showing the right kind of grievance redressal mechanisms. All of that is part of the front end bucket. Then there is the back end, which is kind of getting your house in order, which is reviewing how you're collecting data, creating inventories, creating protocols for things like deletion, you're reviewing your security safeguards, reviewing the processes you have in place for grievance redressal, for user rights, and so on. And the third is your agreements and arrangements with third parties. So evaluating how you're sharing or receiving data from third parties and really negotiating those agreements, capping your liabilities, and making sure you have appropriate indemnities. Those are the three broad categories, and the rules also build on these and add certain additional obligations on under each of these themes. So in the course of this discussion, and we'd love for this to be interactive. So I think what we'll do is after we complete one or two big themes, maybe we'll pause and see if there are any questions for us. But we'll couple of themes in the rules are around children's data, both verifiable parental consent and the restrictions on tracking and monitoring. There are deletion requirements with respect to data, specifically for online gaming intermediaries. There are certain obligations on significant data fiduciaries, which the rules now build on. There are requirements around notice and consent, around user rights, grievance redressal. managing data breaches, which you might have seen a lot of commentary on this recently, security measures, cross-border data transfers, consent managers, and some exceptions. So we'll start with age gating and verifiable, this concept of parental consent. I'm also assuming some level of familiarity that this group might have with the act, because we've spoken about the law for some time now. But if you have any questions, do feel free to jump in and maybe tell us your questions in the chat, and we'll take them up along the course of the discussion. But under the Act, the requirement or the obligations on processing children's data were that if you're processing children's data, you must get parents' verifiable consent. And there was a bar on tracking, monitoring, showing targeted ads to children. Children are individuals aged below 18 years of age. There is some allowance in the law. There was some allowance in the law for providing exceptions, which have come through now in the rules. Now, what the rules add on to this is they say that if you're processing children's data, you must ensure that you have appropriate organizational and technical measures to get parents' verifiable consent. And essentially, it says you have to conduct due diligence to verify that a person giving consent is an adult. So, at the first instance, it's kind of evaluating, identifying whether you have the right kind of measures in place to get parental consent or not. The methods in which one can take parental consent, there's some indication provided in the rules, but granular methods, prescriptive methods have not been specified. So, for example, the rules simply say that if a parent is an existing user of the platform, then you can, these not in so many words, but that's the implication that if the parent is an existing user of the platform, then you can use reliable details of age and identity that are available with the data fiduciary. But if you don't have those reliable details of age and identity, if the parent is not an existing user of the platform, then you must use details of age, identity, or tokens issued by government authorized entities. If we were to break this down, there are really two levels. The first question that arises, and you may have seen again a lot of literature writing on this, is whether this is essentially a requirement to age gate the entire internet. Evaluating, what does that actually mean? What would you have to stop for each platform? Must they first stop and ensure that it's only a person above 18 that is accessing the platform? And once you get to know that it is actually a person below 18, it's a child, then implement some method of VPC, which we'll speak about what the methods are. But just on what that question really means. So for a lot of, let's say for gaming platforms, we've just taken a few examples to see what this might look like in the actual user journey. So typically, currently, a lot of the sign up journeys will simply have enter your mobile number and generate an OTP for you to sign up with a particular platform. In that sign up journey, you're typically required to agree to the terms and conditions and the privacy policy. Now, a lot of platforms in their terms and conditions would indicate that we're only dealing with people above the age of 18 because those are the ones who have the capacity to contract. But would this requirement to ensure that there are measures that you are getting parental consent mean that one has to do something beyond that? I think that's the first level of questioning. And especially for platforms where you know that a large portion of your user base is children, is below the age of 18, perhaps this kind of a statement may not cut it anymore. There are two ways in which one could address an age gate. One is something like this, which is you have a self-declaration saying, I certify that I'm above 18 years of age, where the person in the journey, then at least you're kind of relying on the person certifying and making this declaration that they are indeed an adult. You're not assuming that the person would have read this in the terms and conditions, but in fact, it's upfront on the UI. So one potential way is this, on whether this is going to hold up before the board or not. I think that's another, that's a question of interpretation on seeing whether just a self declaration will suffice. Another way of age gating is a neutral age gate, which is which is essentially asking people to put in their date of birth, and confirming their age rather than saying that you certify that you're above 18, because in this case you are in a way incentivizing people to falsify. One could simply enter this, or rather check this box and move ahead. Whereas here, what would happen is if one were to put in their actual date and it happens to be a child below the age of 18, then you then stop them from proceeding further. If you do indeed find out, if you have actual knowledge at this stage that it's a child. So I think the first level in which we evaluate this is what sort of an age gate would suffice. Does this mean that one has to have something beyond just even this? Does it have to be a more verifiable way of evaluating whether the person, is there an active obligation to ensure that the person is who's accessing your platform is above or below 18? Once, let's say in this instance, if someone has entered their true age and it is below 18, then the platform is required to get their parents' verifiable consent. The two ways in which that could happen is, so if the parent is an existing user of the platform, then the platform can rely on reliable details of age and identity that's available with it. That's the choice for what counts as reliable details of age and identity is left up to the platform to decide. So there is some level of flexibility there. It could be what those methods are. Around the world also, I think nobody's really cracked this problem in a foolproof manner of what is verifiable parental consent. To what extent do you establish that that person is an adult and it's the parent of the child, though that's not an active requirement in the rules. Would an OTP verification suffice? Maybe a lot of platforms ask for a verified payment method like a credit card on file. Could you potentially explore integrations with third parties similar to social login, where a third party has that existing information, but you may not? Or does it necessarily mean asking for some government IDs or documents? Of course, the government is also exploring tokens, a token-based method of identity, of verifiable parental consent, actually, and age tokens, potentially through state family IDs or through APAR IDs or through other means where it's not that the platform has to actively collect more and more information, but you kind of build on top of digital infra, public infra, and you ping the authority and it tells you a yes or no without you having to collect more documents. But I think this will take some time to develop. While there are certain discussions ongoing, we'll have to see really what that framework looks like. But in the interim, it looks like it's these sort of ID documents, or if the parent is an existing user of the platform, then asking some reliable details. I think this raises a few questions and concerns for a lot of platforms, including the gaming platforms, which perhaps on multiple levels. One is whether there is an active obligation to do something beyond a self-declaration like this at the first instance. And if you are let's say a free-to-play game and you are actually geared towards children also, in those circumstances, would that mean what kind of verifiable parental consent workflow would you develop? So there are a few ideas, but I think a little more clarity is also awaited. I'll actually pause to see if people have questions or thoughts on this.
One question.
Yeah.
So this age consent, do we have to take it in every journey, user journey? Can we take it in sign up flow? And when the user is coming back for again and signing in, we have already taken his age consent. So is it mandatory to again show the checkbox, I certify that I am above 18 years during the transaction journey?
I think I'd argue that when at the time of sign up, if you sort of ascertain that that person is above 18, that might work. But again, this kind of depends on whether the self-declaration like this would suffice, or does it have to be a neutral age gate. Besides that, I think if it's there in the sign up journey, and that number is kind of associated, and you've verified in some way that this is actually an adult, that should suffice. That's what current market practice indicates, that in the sign-up journey, you're establishing identity, doing the verification, and perhaps at each stage, then it's the same person logging in. So you have some data on file to be able to verify that. You pick up from there rather than asking them to self-declare each time.
Srinidhi, I think there's another question on chat from Garima.
Yeah. I can't see the question. Bobby, if you could read it out. Yeah.
The question is, what's your view on whether self-declaration of age will suffice or something more needs to be done by platforms to verify the age?
Yeah, so I think that has been the big question. We've seen a lot of commentary on whether self-declaration suffices, or there is an active obligation to do anything beyond that. I think we're sort of reading this some level of, I think, pragmatism, because otherwise, if all platforms are required to establish some sort of an age gate, and there's a spectrum. Even in the examples that I've given you, there are three. One is just stuff it in the T's and C's. One is this kind of a self-declaration, and the other is a neutral age gate. And I think the determination of what works best is specific to the organization. You read into what is appropriate organizational and technical measure, perhaps looking at the nature of the platform, maybe even the level of harm possible through the platform, any risks to children by use of the platform, to have a more balanced and sort of a reasonable view on what kind of age gate would work. But I think for this to realistically work, some self-declaration type of mechanism is the only thing that can really, at scale, make this feasible. Just because otherwise that would mean that you're at the entry stage itself, you're collecting an excessive amount of data to be even able to identify whether the person moving forward is whether you can allow them to enter, or whether you need to go back and get consent in some form, a verifiable parental consent, that sort of workflow. So I think some level of balance one might have to read in. Of course, if there's a greater susceptibility or greater likelihood of harm to a child, maybe you then need to have something more stringent. But even there, or maybe even just playing around between this kind of a self-certification versus an age gate, where if one actually enters their true, here there's I know that FTC and certain other regions prefer neutral age gates to a self-declaration which says I certify I'm above 18, because that might incentivize people to just go ahead and falsify and move ahead. So this might be something that we see more commonly on platforms where you see more and more children coming in at the first instance. I do also acknowledge, and we've heard this a lot, that if it's merely a self-declaration, we're not sure if that will achieve the objective of the law. But perhaps reading it in a more pragmatic, balanced way, and reading some level of flexibility in this, ensuring appropriate technical and organizational measures. Okay, if there are no other questions, we'll move on to the second theme, which is related to children's data, which is the, yeah. Did someone unmute? No, okay. So the second theme is related to this one, which is the bar on tracking and monitoring. Now, under the Act, data fiduciaries were barred from tracking, behaviorally monitoring, showing targeted ads which are directed at children. But there are a few exceptions that have been set out in the rules. These are for clinical establishments providing health services, educational institutions for educational activities or children's safety. There are some exceptions to verify whether the user is a child, some exceptions to verify and make sure that you're blocking access to harmful content, or if it's the government providing services. So essentially what this means is that there's tracking and monitoring. If you don't fall into one of these exceptions, and it's a child on your platform, you've gotten their parents' consent, and now let's say they're playing a game on the platform, the bar is sort of an absolute bar. It says you can't track or behaviorally monitor or show targeted ads to children. So there are a few things that can that then get a bit concerning. Let's take this example where a platform is offering games based on combat, creative building, the social interaction. Now you're personalizing the kids' experience, as is very commonly done across platforms. You track gameplay preferences and besides active choices, you also see what is the kind of behavior that the kids are showing on the platform. Now and you decide that a child who's playing more of certain kinds of games or is in this creative mode, you recommend new tools to them, new building challenges. But someone who's essentially, this is classic kind of personalization. But it looks like this is no longer allowed because there isn't a clear exception for platforms. So that means no level of personalization involved for which is kind of based on tracking and profiling and looking at the child's usage on the platform, suggesting further games to them, suggesting further content to them. Targeted ads, of course, is also a no-go. So personalization, in-game features, user experience, this is kind of one bucket, and there's no exception for us to get around this, or no exception for us for personalizing content. The second kind of tracking monitoring you might be doing is, let's say, to prevent any kind of bullying or harassment, or to ensure that children are not being able to access any harmful content. I think to this limited extent, the exception in the rules, which says that you can track and monitor data to this limited purpose, which is to ensure that children aren't exposed to harmful content. This might be relevant in some circumstances and for some purposes, on just for this kind of a limited purpose, but not for personalization generally. And also some level of tracking, monitoring, which you could be doing for, let's say, preventing cheating, or you monitor unusual gameplay patterns, you monitor in-game actions, but from the perspective of flagging any kind of behavior that is akin to cheating. Perhaps you could rely on the exception in the act itself, which says there are certain things that platforms can do, that data fiduciaries can do to prevent any offense or prevent any contravention of any law. But besides these exceptional circumstances, a typical personalization of a platform, curating a user's feed, curating a user's experience. If the user is a child, there are no exceptions for this. There's also, this question on, there's only an exception for educational. There's, of course, for clinical establishments also. There's also an exception for educational institutions. So we've also gotten questions around what if, while it's a gaming platform, let's say it's a math-based or science-based, some games. Is there an argument to be made that this is also an educational institution? So perhaps that's something to explore as well. But it's likely that is intended for more where some institutions or data fiduciary whose primary business is sort of the business of education. So again, I'll pause to see if there are any questions on this one. I also again do understand that this kind of bar on personalization is a huge impact on businesses. Unfortunately, under the Act, it's a blanket bar. It's not one that is related to or linked to any harmful behavior or harmful content. Not content actually, but it's not linked to harm to individuals. It's a bar simpliciter that you can't do tracking and monitoring and targeted advertising at children. And in the three examples that I've given, it's also a question on whether you can switch on personalization for things like cheating and to make sure that tracking, to make sure that the child is not being harassed or being exposed to harmful content, but keep it off for just enhancing user experience or curating the feed. So whether we have the engineering sort of ability to do that as well and use it for those purposes. I'll pause to see if there are any questions in the chat or any other.
No questions in the chat.
Okay, so the next theme is on data deletion. The requirement in the rules So in the act, the requirement in the act was that businesses must delete data when the purpose of collection has been met, when the purpose of collection is served. And there was some flexibility in determining timelines. So, for example, if I'm an e-commerce platform and actually e-commerce is not the right example because there's a specific exception, but essentially if the purpose of the platform is not just a purchase, but to provide an overall shopping experience, enabling usage of the platform to the individual, you have some flexibility on determining when the purpose of collection is deemed to be met. But for three types of businesses in the rules, online gaming intermediaries with 50 lakh users, e-commerce and social media platforms with 2 crore registered users, if the individual has been inactive for a period of 3 years, then you must go ahead and actually delete their data. Now, inactivity as such, inactivity is just a phrase I'm using. The phrase used in the law is that if the individual hasn't approached you, initiated any sort of interaction with you or for exercise of their rights, approached you for exercise or meeting the specified purpose, then you must go ahead and delete their data. And there's a 3-year timeline that's prescribed. This 3-year countdown will kick in from when the rules take effect or from the last user interaction. You must actually send individuals a notification 48 hours before deletion, letting them know, giving them the chance to keep their account live. But that's the idea, that if you are a platform which falls under any of these buckets, especially I mean, yeah, if it's a gaming platform which has more than 50 lakh users, then that means that you must actually delete the individual's data, have these auto filters, triggers to notify individuals and then to go ahead and delete the data. There are certain exceptions that if the data is required for legal compliance, like tax or accounting purposes, you can retain that data. If it's required under PMLA or any other laws which regulate you and which require you to retain data, you must retain that data. There is an exception for that. In addition, if you can also retain data which is to allow individuals to access their account and access tokens or any accrued benefits. This is again only for the benefit of the individual, that they should be able to access their account once even past that 3-year window. A couple of questions that become relevant herein is when does that 3-year timeline really kick in? So let's take the example of Sprint. It's one platform we've just come up with this, which is let's say X created an account on this platform 5 years ago. So now the question is, in many of these in any of these scenarios, actually, when would you say that the deletion timeline really kicks in? So let's say X logged into her account last month, but she hasn't played a game in the last 3 years. She's opened the app, she has it on her phone, she opens it now and then, but hasn't actually actively used it to play a game. That's one scenario. Then another is, let's say X deleted the app on her phone 3 years back, hasn't visited the website either. I think this is one of those extreme scenarios where the app is not on her phone. She's actually chosen to actively delete it from her phone, hasn't gone on to the website either. Perhaps here is where the 3-year timeline will kick in from the time that she sort of, deleted the app. It was an active intent on her part to delete it and not go back. Then there's a circumstance where you may still have the app on your phone, but haven't logged into it in 3 years. This is somewhere, I think the two circumstances that given were on extreme ends. This is in the middle where you have the app on your phone, but so you haven't deleted it. There isn't active intent to delete it. But could you, just from the fact that the app continues to be on your phone and you continue to maybe, let's say, update it based on some annual updates that come through, can that be a signal that the 3-year timeline only shouldn't kick in because you're still the individual is still continues to have the app on her phone, hasn't signaled that she's kind of done with it, still retains the app. on her phone. Another circumstance could be where she has the app but hasn't logged in 3 years. Only 3 years back she logged in, though she's opened the app. So here I'm trying to make a distinction between the active effort to log in versus just opening the app. Where would you say inactivity can be will kick in from? Is it from the last login or just from opening of the app? Because even with opening of the app, you have personal identifiers like device identifiers, which you can identify that it's the same person who's attempting to open this app. Similarly, if one simply opens the website but hasn't logged into the account in 3 years' time, what will be the circumstance? I think so. Lots of questions get raised on precisely what is the time when the 3-year deletion timeline kicks in. I think the one of the more reasonable themes seem like where there is, opening the app. You continue to have the app on the phone and you continue to open it, whether you've logged in or not, which is scenario 4. I think there's some intent to show that the individual is still interested in retaining the app on their phone. And I'm kind of leaning towards that, but I think every business will sort of make a determination as to when would you read the where would you kick in inactivity from. But the objective of the law is that if the individual shows no interest and it's a dormant account, it's been inactive for a while, then you remind them, and then you go ahead and delete their data. The other question now is, once you know when the timeline kicks in, what is the data that you must delete and what is the data that you retain? You'll, of course, this means creating detailed data inventories, and I think that's an exercise that platforms need to do. All data fiduciaries need to do on evaluating, sitting with all of the teams and identifying what is the data that's collected at each stage of the gaming journey, on just signing up, on creating an account, on playing games. There is multiple different data points that are collected through the user journey on the platform. So let's say at the time of sign up, there's only an email address or a phone number, but there's a lot of other behavioral data, as in when the user starts their gameplay data, their winnings. If it's a real money gaming platform, there a lot of behavioral data as well on what is it that they're more likely to click on, what are the kinds of games that they're more interested in, some profiling data. There's across the board a lot of data that of the user that gets generated. The exception which allows you to retain some data only allows you to retain data required to enable the user to access her account and access tokens or get accrued benefit, whatever accrued benefits there are, essentially any tokens or rewards associated with the account. So this scope of exactly what is user account is also interesting. Would it simply just mean the email address or the phone number that the user kept to log in? Is it account history? Let's say the person made some in-app purchases, in-game purchases as well. Any invoices, any other information that's related to the user's account, all of that information can you retain? I think another important piece is any rewards, because it allows you to retain data that is related to their access their tokens or any rewards. Would that also mean the underlying transaction history around that you can retain or not, um, under this exception? So I think businesses would need to evaluate, create that inventory, identify what data is required for what purpose, and perhaps also look at seeking clarity on what exactly is the data that is required to be retained, or whether it's simply, if the intention is to discourage sort of dormant accounts and continued extended retention of data, then should the individual be able to revive their revive their account? Let's say it's been 3 years and the user hasn't logged in, but right after that they actually do show an interest. Can they revive their earlier account? And if they have to do that, then you must also have all of that data on file. So a couple of pieces that become relevant is establishing these deletion protocols, internal flags when the 3-year timeline kicks in, evaluating retention timelines for each record that you have, having a periodic sort of a review, and really sensitizing also the team on what is data that you're deleting and retaining. I will once again pause to take any questions. If anyone has any questions on deletion or actually anything else that we've spoken about before.
Hi, I have a question. Let should I just go ahead? Okay. Hello.
Hi. Please go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah. So let us say you specifically mentioned that about the keeping the data related to rewards and payouts. So now the reward and payout data is directly in the relation with the certain personal data such as bank account details, VPAs and all. So how exactly are we looking at I mean, that's the data that we have to keep, right? Because he has a reward, he hasn't used the platform for last 3 years, uh, and he's actually entitled to get that particular amount of reward, and he decides to do it after 3 years. So how exactly is that going to happen?
Yeah. So I think for these scenarios only there is a specific exception which says you allow individuals, you retain data to enable the individual to access her account and access any virtual token that's issued by the platform, and which is stored with you, which can be used to get money or goods or services. And I think your question is on what all can you retain under that? Can you then retain the bank account details, financial
Hmm.
details that one has? I do read it that way, that you essentially it's kind of leaving it up to the business to make the determination on whatever that data set is that is required for the individual to be able to meaningfully access her token or her reward, that you keep that on file. I think the more conservative reading would be that you keep a record of what they have, but you ask them to subsequently again furnish financial details related to bank account, once they revive it after 3 years. But I think there's some flexibility there on how you read this, enabling the individual to access her account and enabling her to access the tokens. For her to meaningfully access the tokens, you may need certain underlying data associated with that reward or the token.
Okay. Okay.
I
I
think
guess that's
someone
that
else
answers.
unmuted. Niyati. Okay. Any other questions on the deletion aspect? No questions in the chat
No
box.
questions.
Okay, so the next theme in the law is around significant data fiduciaries. Now, why I think this is relevant for this group particularly is, while there's actually no indication of who these SDFs are going to be still, it's just what the law had said, which is that the government will designate significant data fiduciaries, a class of data fiduciaries, as significant based on volume and risk of volume and sensitivity of the data and other risks, integrity, sovereignty of India, those sort of factors. But because there are specific references to gaming and social media and even e-commerce in other parts of the law, specifically with deletion, just think, there could be potentially likelihood of other platforms like gaming or even other regulated entities being tagged as significant data fiduciaries. So just important, I think, to have in mind what the obligations are on them. Building on what the Act had said, which is that you must appoint a data protection officer who's resident in India, you must conduct DPIAs and data audits. The rules also now say that the DPIAs and the data audits have to be annual, and you have to submit any significant observations that you get from those DPIAs and audits to the board. Now, this is interesting. While essentially, around the world, data protection impact assessments are based on some specific activity. So let's say you're starting to develop or some new sort of authentication mechanism you develop or becomes part of the sign up journey, where there's some risk to individual. Whenever there's a new feature or a new technology usage or something new that you're rolling out, typically those are circumstances where data protection impact assessments have to be conducted globally under GDPR and other regimes. But under the Indian law, the approach is a little different. The approach that was taken was, if you are deemed to be, if you're designated as a significant data fiduciary, you must conduct DPIs for all your processing activities. Um, and in addition, of course, there's also the data audit requirement. How we are thinking of the two is, data audit is more like a gap assessment, like you identify how you maybe have infosec audits, where for this requirement in the law, what is the thing that we have done? If it's a requirement to get notice, then this is the change we've made in our UI. This is the inventorization we have done for the data. So audit is more like gap assessment, that for this requirement, this is the actionable. Whereas a DPI or an impact assessment is evaluating the risks to the individual's rights. Um, for example, let's say if you're using AI for grievance redressal, then actually not AI for grievance, yeah, maybe AI for grievance redressal, is that impeding the rights of the individual that are provided in the act, which is to access information, access actually grievances as well. Similarly, if you're using AI to train your models further, would that mean, how would that play against the requirement of deletion, or the right that individuals have to seek deletion of their data? And why I focus on rights is because that's the framing in the law, that you evaluate risks to the individual's rights, and the rights are what are provided for in the law are the right to access, seek rectification, grievance redressal, deletion. So you evaluate what are the risks to those to the individuals. There's of course the interesting requirement that you have to submit some observations around this to the board periodically. We don't have other information on what further the board will do with it, but perhaps the assumption is, if something were to happen, there's a record of what were the practices of the company, whether they've been submitting that periodically or not. So a few questions, that we've gotten a lot is, let's say it's a global platform, you conduct DPIs across the board at HQ level, at your, let's say your companies in the US or UK or some other place. Would the same report work in India? And it might not, because there's some sort of requirement here that you have the purpose documented, you look at the risks to the individuals, but because there's some flexibility, the rules do not set out in detail how you conduct a DPIA. Perhaps you can use some of those similar findings here as well. But there are two other requirements which are more open-ended for SDFs. One is that there's kind of a I wouldn't say reintroduction, but essentially the rules now say that if you're designated as an SDF, then there is a government appointed committee. This committee will recommend to the government what is the kind of data that SDFs must store in India. Now we understand from conversations with by remarks that the minister and the government officials have made, that this is not intended to reintroduce sort of localization, but it's more as a harmonization for sectoral regulators as well. You'd be familiar with RBI, IRDAI. I mean, different sectoral regulators have come up with their own categories of data, like payment service businesses have to localize payment data. So it's sort of maybe to harmonize some sectoral approaches with the government, but this is something to keep an eye out for on, or seek more clarity on what exactly this means. And there's also this requirement to conduct due diligence to verify that the algorithmic software that that you use does not pose risks to individuals' rights. Now, again, this is fairly broadly worded. So things like algorithmic software could be really any kind of technology that you're any algorithm that you're running. But what might be the scope of this due diligence? We still sort of await some clarification on precise expectation here. I will once again pause to see if anyone has questions on SDFs. Okay. So the other theme was on cross-border data transfers. I think we already spoke about this significant data fiduciary obligation, but the simpliciter sort of for all data fiduciaries also there is a restriction now that while transfers are allowed, the government may come up with some conditions from time to time for sharing data with foreign governments. How we read this is that perhaps the government might come up with conditions like how for those of you who are familiar with the GDPR, under the standard contractual clauses where data exporters in the EU can share data with offshore data vendors, is one of the contractual conditions is that if the vendor is asked to provide data to a foreign government, let's say it's an Indian vendor and the Indian government seeks data from the vendor through a Section 91 request. In those circumstances, the data importer is first obliged to the extent allowed under law, first notify the data exporter, and then try and object to the processing, object to the access in at the first instance. Certain conditions essentially on whether you can easily share data with foreign governments or not, whether that access will be restricted or not. So perhaps something similar, but again, this is fairly open-ended at the moment. Then there are other requirements around notice. The rules clarify. So the Act had already said that you must provide individuals a notice when you're seeking their consent. And the notice has to have what data you collect, what purposes you collect them for, and so on. Now, the rules add another layer to it. They say that the notice must be presented in clear, plain terms. It has to be understandable independently of other information given to users. It should contain a fair account of the details, but at a minimum, it has to be an itemized description of the personal data, the purposes, the services. There has to be a link to the website or app to allow users to exercise their rights, withdraw consent, complain to the board, and so on. Now, what all, so itemized description would essentially mean simply having a broad category may not cut it. You have to have more details in the privacy notice that you show. Again, so I think we're very used to seeing such statements on the UI, which is that by signing, I agree to the terms, or simply actually even nothing sometimes. But I think this will not cut it anymore. There has to be something more on the UI itself, the notice being shown, the pop-up being shown there itself. So merely linking the privacy policy may not cut it. This means we must update privacy notices, and often, we see a lot of privacy notices and policies which are drafted in a way that there is one section which lists out a laundry list of data that the platform might be collecting, and another section which sets out all the purposes that the platform may be using the data for, but there's no linkage between the two. So I think going forward, privacy notices will have a lot more linkage between those two sections. For instance, if you're using data across different journeys like sign up, profile creation, gameplay, all of this would first have to be indicated and at relevant points wherever. I mean, I also understand this wouldn't mean that each step, each click that the individual is making, they're first shown a notice of sorts. And then they must continue. This shouldn't mean that either, but at the same time, minimizing the friction in the customer journey, but also showing relevant notices at relevant points in time to the individual. So essentially, just reviewing the entire platform journey and showing notices at relevant times. There are many examples through which this could be done, maybe layered notices, intermediate screens, drop downs, and so on, but essentially reviewing the UI from that perspective. I'll again pause to see if there are any questions, and I do realize that we're at 3:53, so we have a couple more minutes, but any questions?
No questions, really.
Okay. So the next few themes are more operationalizing than big obstacles or disruptors, I would say. For example, for enabling user rights, the requirement is that you must publish clear, easily accessible methods for users to request data access and erasure. You must implement mechanisms for users to easily exercise their rights. So this would mean that you may need to automate user rights processes as well, like allowing them to make data access requests, data deletion requests, develop also very clear communication channels internally, like having dedicated support portals or helplines for user queries, providing user-friendly dashboards as well. But again, this is a question of scale. If you have a lot of queries and if you have a lot of requests, then essentially putting in place automated features or automated methods to do this. This is just one example that we picked out on having an automated way of data deletion. Essentially, the idea would be to reduce friction for the individual, that they're able to easily make these requests. But there's no one way which is hard coded in the rules. It is left up to the business to decide as they scale. Another theme which you might have seen, a lot of commentary on is on security and breach management. Now, the requirement in the law is the act had already said that you must implement reasonable security safeguards. The rules add certain minimum requirements, which include encryption, obfuscation, masking, virtual token mapping, access controls, creating and maintaining logs for detecting unauthorized access, data backups, retaining logs for 1 year, and including these security requirements in agreements with data processors. A lot of this might get reflected already for companies that have, let's say, the ISO certification 27001, or some robust security protocols. But one would still have to review whether all of this is in place, and also ensure that any agreements you have with third parties incorporate these requirements. And a related theme to security is on breaches. Now, I think we already know that platforms do need to report to CERT within 6 hours of any have to mandatorily report certain incidents, including certain incidents which have to be reported within 6 hours. On top of that, the Data Protection Act also put in an obligation to report data breaches both to the Data Protection Board and to affected individuals. Unfortunately, in the rules also, there is no risk-based threshold for reporting. So essentially what that means is, if there is, what the law says is, if there is a data breach, then without delay, immediately on becoming aware, you must report the breach to the affected individual. You have to give them details of the breach. You have to tell them potential consequences, how they can mitigate any sort of impact on them. And there is also a tiered notification to the board. The first notification has to happen immediately on becoming aware, which is sort of an initial intimation, and followed by a more detailed report within 72 hours, which includes a description of the breach and its nature, extent, timing, the perpetrator, likely impact, and so on. 72 hours may still end up being a very sharp timeline for a lot of companies, especially because sometimes complex scenarios may take longer to actually remediate. But the law currently has this sort of an allowance. I mean, you can approach the board for an extended timeline, but that can add some pressure to breach management. But this would mean essentially recalibrating your incident protocol, response protocols, then making sure you're able to meet the timelines, report to the board, report to CERT, and any other requirements as well. You keep templates ready for communication to individuals as well, and have sort of template documents for different scenarios, and so that once an incident occurs, there's kind of seamless coordination among the different teams internally. And I think breaches are also fairly widely defined in the Act. So there have been lots of questions around whether this would mean what would constitute a breach, because any kind of unauthorized access or processing is actually breach under the Act. Would that mean an unattended just laptop that an employee has left in a restaurant briefly? Would that be a breach? Or would it be just an employee leaving their own salary slip on the photocopy machine somewhere of a large building? So there are many such instances which could actually trigger a breach requirement if it's read very widely. So also evaluating what exactly would constitute a breach for your company, having an internal risk matrix as well, and having these protocols in place for breach reporting. Yeah, is there a question? You can mute.
So there's one question, which is what happens if the platform doesn't have the required details to be reported to the DPP within the 72 hours?
Yeah. So I think the rules also say that you can seek an extension within those 72 hours also, maybe asking the board for more time to get all of the details, because I do appreciate that it may not be possible within 72 hours to have a final sort of a report and and conclusive kind of determination. But if in the current form is what the rules get notified eventually, I think we hope that the board will sort of account for those circumstances and allow companies a little more time. Of course, that raises its own concerns as to capacity of the board to be able to actually take in the amount of queries and notifications and questions that are coming in and be able to respond. But I think the intention here might be that you try and report as much as you can. You put in an initial report, and then as and when you get more information, you provide that further information. I think we've seen that with the cert directions as well. But I do understand that the 72-hour timeline for a final report seems pretty sharp, and we're seeing a lot of folks kind of try and engage with the government and ask queries on what that would look like in practice, because that can be a quite challenging. But I do hope that eventually, if this is the form in which they're notified, there's some leeway provided to businesses for such reasonable circumstances. Okay. So I think the other themes, so we discussed user rights. There's also this consent manager piece, and I'll just very briefly talk about it. I think we've seen that in the act that it was a bit of an unknown on who these consent managers would be. There is some more detailing in the rules. So there are requirements like they must be eligibility criteria as to who these consent managers will be. They, of course, must be incorporated in India. They have a minimum net worth requirement. There are other criteria provided, like having suitable KMPs, capital structure, so on. There are some requirements that they should not be reading the contents of the data when making it available. They must avoid conflict with data fiduciaries, and other requirements to conduct audits, that they must not subcontract, they must act as a fiduciary to the individual. So the some of these pieces, they offer some more clarity to who can be a consent manager. But at the same time, I think just the monetization revenue opportunities for consent managers is unclear. Also, currently, it looks like it is voluntary to integrate with consent managers. There's nothing in the law to right now indicate that one must be compelled to sort of integrate. But yeah, I think the idea is that this is for the benefit of the individuals. It's also interesting that the two examples of consent managers that are given in the rules are both in the context of financial sector, of the financial sector. One is like a pull from DigiLocker. The other is on sharing of data, which does make us wonder if this means this is sort of infrastructure where to enable, whether the idea is to have data sharing, or is it just as a UI change in the beginning to manage the consent flow. But yes, as far as impact on gaming businesses as such, not really, but just more on keeping an eye out to the future on who these entities are and if it might be worth integrating with them. Uh, there are a couple of other requirements in the rules, like the fact that the government can request for certain information, which would mean that we have to then create those protocols internally to be able to respond to them. There are also certain exceptions in the law, like for research and statistical purposes, and it may be interesting to see exactly what the purpose of these exceptions are. Is it also geared towards let's say use for AI or other research? But I understand that the government and some officials have also mentioned that that may not be the case. That this is more for sort of pure play research and not commercial research.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Srinidhi. I think for a issue which is as critical as it can be, it was a very nuanced explanation, and I'm sure our members and industry colleagues will go back with some clarity on the issues. And however, having said that, should there be any further queries, and you all can reach out to IMAI